Hey guys, welcome back to another tutorial. Today I'll be discussing how I go about texturing objects. I'll be discussing things like edgeware, different wear masks and everything. I'll also be discussing glass in Eevee, which is something that a lot of people I feel like overlook and don't do properly. Just as a disclaimer, I wanted to let you guys know that what I will be showing you is not the proper way to texture objects, probably. It's definitely not realistic. It's just what I think looks nice. Hey guys, this is after I recorded the video. We just hit 1,000 subscribers. Thank you guys so much. This is an awesome milestone. As a celebration, I'm going to try to do a Q&A video. If you have any comments about my art, about anything else, feel free to drop them down below. I'll also probably be putting up a community post you can comment on. And yeah, hopefully I'll get the video out in the next week or two. We'll see. We'll be working with this archway to start with. I'll put a link in the description. You can download this file and work along with me. To start off, let's set up our scene. So if we go into rendered, we can see there's really nothing here. Let's start by adding a sun so we can work with some lighting, which would be helpful. I'd say set this to about 3. And now the lighting is still pretty bland though. Like the world is just plain gray. So in Eevee, if we disable the scene world and then just bring down the strength of the world, this actually, it's not accurate, but it looks pretty nice. It's good for texturing. Next up, let's set up some of these scene settings. We'll enable ambient occlusion, screen space reflections, and refraction. I like to just bring these settings all the way up. Under shadows, let's set the cascade size to 4096. If you don't have a very strong PC though, I don't recommend doing this. I think that's just about it here. Also, in the sun, under the shadows, we're going to enable contact shadows to have more accurate shadows. Okay, now we can get into the actual material making. Let's open up the shader editor. And first off, I am going to set up a base color, right? We want this to be red, or I want it to be red. You can choose a different color if you want. I'd say something about that. Setting this as plain red though is a little boring. So let's grab a noise texture and a mix RGB. Put the noise texture into the second value. Grab this, set this to multiply, and plug this into the base color instead. We can mess with the scale of the noise till we see it. As we can see, the noise is kind of distorted. To get around this, let's just add a texture coordinate node. And instead of using generated coordinates, which is what it uses by default, let's use object coordinates. This will kind of avoid the weird stretching. Okay, there we go. We have some base color. Okay, next up, a strategy that I use a lot is for making masks is using vectors and coordinates. So a lot of people, to make, say, a gradient across your object, will use a gradient texture. A lot of beginners will do this. Use a gradient texture, and okay, it is going across the object. But say you wanted it to go in the y-axis, you'd have to add your texture coordinate node, rotate it, and it's kind of finicky. Like it doesn't line up properly half the time. It's just annoying to use. Instead of using that, what I find to be much easier is to use this texture coordinate node and then the separate XYZ node. And then just by plugging in different coordinates, you can get the different gradients on an object. For example, this is the X gradient, this is the Y, and the Z as well. And just even with these, there's so much you can do. Another one that I find very helpful to use is the UV coordinates. I really like to use a kind of weird strategy, but it works well for me. I'll unwrap the object specifically to line up for this texturing method. So for example, if I want edgeware at the ends of the cylinders, I can line up the UVs so that it goes from the bottom to the top, basically. And now if I look at the Y coordinates of the UVs, we'll have this nice gradient going all the way across the cylinders. Now this is really helpful for different edgeware masks where you only want it in specific places. So for example, for this, I'd want edgeware at the ends. Also, we can see that the gradient is showing up on the ends of the cylinders. So if we don't want that, we can just grab these and scale them to 0 so that they're only going to show one value, and then I'm just going to put them at the bottom where they'll show black. Okay, now we want our edgeware on both ends of the cylinder, not just one end. So to quickly do that, we can just add a color ramp. Set this to exactly in the middle, and grab a new flag and bring this to black. Okay, so now that we have a kind of mask showing where the ends of our cylinders are, how do we actually get it to look like edgeware? This is a method that I actually see very few people use, but it's really helpful for me. I usually grab a noise texture. In this case, I think I'm gonna use the UV coordinates to get it to line up with the direction of the cylinders. And I'm going to, where's the mapping node? I'm going to stretch it a bit on the Y, just like this. How we can incorporate these is using a math node, plugging this into the basic mask into the math node, and using the greater than function. And with this, we get this weird output. We are kind of getting different wear effects, I guess, but it looks pretty strange. So to mess around with it, you can add a map range node in before the noise and mess around with all this. We can also see it's low quality and it's a little weird. Like when we move it, it's not just moving in 2D space. So we can go ahead and set this to 2D, and now it won't move as weirdly. Also, it's kind of low quality and doesn't look very good. So we can bring the detail up, I'd say to like 6 and maybe a bit more roughness, as well as bringing the scale up. So that's kind of edgeware. I don't know, it looks okay. Now let's incorporate this back into the base color. We can use a mix RGB and then put this into the factor. We're gonna swap this since we want the wood to be showing at the ends, and we can choose a woody kind of color, maybe like that. If we look at this, I mean, it looks pretty terrible, right? So to start with, let's make a kind of albedo base color for the wood. For this, I'm actually going to use, I think I'm going to duplicate this and use something similar. Let's make that a little longer on the Y. And now I can just use a mix RGB here with this as the factor. Let me see, what was the color I chose here? And then choose another color. Maybe change the hue a bit. Now we can put this into the color for the wood. And when we look at this, it still looks pretty darn bad, right? So to make it look like the paint is on top of the wood and the paint is kind of flaking off, we can add some bump. we'll use the mask for the paint as the height and put this into the normal. This does not look good, so let's bring down the strength. Let's also check, okay, so we want the black to be the wood and the white to be the paint so that the paint looks higher than the wood. Something a little like that, keeping the value pretty low. Now actually looks a bit more 3D. What else we can do, because the wood still looks pretty terrible, is duplicate this bump node and put the noise, wait for it to load the material, put the noise into the height from the wood. And it looks kind of strange, right? We don't want the paint to also have the to have the bumps. So you can simply just use mix RGB, put the greater than into the factor. Let's preview this. We want the paint to just be black for the bump map. Let's look at this again. Okay, so now it's constrained to only the wood, but it still looks pretty terrible, right? Like it's too sharp. So there's this weird workaround to make the bump not look sharp. I don't know why this works exactly, and it only kind of works, but using a map range node, we can set the interpolation mode, I think, to smoother step. And then just bring the to minimum up closer to the maximum, or the other way around. And as we get close to it, it kind of smooths it out. And then even if we bring the strength up, it should still look smoother. Now, this wood is kind of looking too fine for me, so I'm going to bring the scale down even further. Maybe the roughness as well. A little better. Also, so far we've only been working with base color and normals. Let's start looking at, what did I do? I did not mean to do that. Let's start looking at roughness. So I think the paint should probably have about this roughness, but wood is generally more rough, right? So we can use a mix RGB with our mask as the factor, set to mix. Let's see. So the second value will be the roughness of our paint, and the first will be the roughness of our wood. I'm going to bring the wood roughness up farther, maybe there. Let's see how that looks. Maybe a little too far. Something like that, maybe. Let's bring this up a bit farther. Okay. Something also I'd like to do is just add a bevel modifier. These sharp edges are really bugging me. Alright, next up, let's add a bit more detail to this. Let's add like sunwear coming from the top, like kind of like the sun has worn down the paint on the upwards facing faces. We can use this texture coordinates again, use the separate XYZ just like before, but instead of using UV coordinates, we're going to use normal coordinates. We want the Z coordinates, like the face is facing upwards. And let's grab a color ramp to kind of clamp down on this a bit. Then I'm going to use the same noise as before, just offset it a little differently. I think I'm going to want to squish it along the Y, like this. Maybe stretch it along the X. Let's see how that looks using the math set to greater than. And with the map range node instead of in front of the noise texture. I kind of like how that looks. Maybe it's a bit too intense. Let's bring this up. Yeah. Now to add this to our mask, we can add a reroute in right before here and mix these together. We're going to put this into the factor and set this to black so that now it's mixing into our mask. Looking at this again, we can see it's not too bad. It looks decent. A little strange, but like this is just a quick tutorial, so it's good enough. I'm not really feeling the wood color, so I'm just gonna drop it a hue saturation value and mess around with it. Maybe something a little lighter. Something like that, maybe. The last thing I'm gonna do to really make the worn wood on top stand out more, I'm going to use this mask. I'm going to duplicate these so that we can make this more pronounced, maybe. Let's like this. I'm going to use this as a mask to lighten the paint color on top. Kind of like it's been bleached by the sun. Bring the value up a bit. And the saturation down maybe. Also maybe make it a bit more yellow. And then if you kind of like the overall colors, but you don't want it as intense, you can just drop in a map range and bring the maximum down. Now we see it's a little faded on top. Maybe I should just use the color ramp instead. I don't know if I like these sharp edges. That's a little better, it's more faint. Okay, so another thing is, overall it looks nice, but these columns on the sides are kind of barren. They're just paint, whereas the rest is kind of scuffed up. So, to remedy that, we can just add a noise texture. And let's grab a color ramp. Bring up the contrast, as well as the detail and roughness. We're having the distortion from the generated coordinates like earlier, so let's grab the object coordinates. I'm not feeling the color ramp, I want something more sharp, so I'm going to go ahead and use the greater than node. Bring the threshold up, so we just have a few spots, and then we'll go ahead and mix this in just like before. Put it into the factor. Let's check this to make sure it's looking right, yeah. and then we can preview the material again. Okay, we've got a few speckles, but let's bring the threshold down a bit so we can actually see those more. A little more detail. There we go. Not too bad. This isn't like great looking in any way, but it's good enough. Also, to vary the roughness a bit, since it's a little uniform, we can just grab some noise down here, mix them together. We can use multiply maybe. Looking at the reflection, let's see. We'll also want to use the generated coordinates. We don't want to use the generated coordinates. We want to use the object coordinates. Bring the scale up, maybe a bit more detail and roughness. Okay. Now let's check this out again. Maybe also we want a bit more contrast. And of course, we don't want the multiply this intense. We can bring this down, and that'll just kind of give it a bit more variation. We can see the reflection from the sun is a bit more varied now. Just little things like this help to add some more. You can see on the ends of the arch, the wood texture isn't working, but since this is a short tutorial, I'm not going to go into that. It's just because of the UV coordinates that we used. Just varying the wood texture a bit. This is very basic, like wood texturing. I'd probably recommend just using a texture for the wood, but the overall strategies of making the masks and stuff would stay the same. I think that's mostly it. This is a pretty quick and lazy texturing. This will also work in cycles, of course. If we go into cycles, we'll see, here it is. Let's enable the GPU. Here's the arch, it looks basically the same. One more thing I want to touch on before we move on to glass is edgeware without just using the UV mask. In cycles, you can use the geometry node and the pointiness attribute will give you basically a pointiness mask. You can see on the edges when I use the color ramp, there's a mask at the edges that's like, basically the more pointy an angle is, the more highlighted it will be. This is really useful for edgeware. I use it a lot. I only use the UV edgeware like this for like strange cases that I want more control on. This is really handy for just random objects. I used it a lot in the bedroom scene that I just did. In Eevee though, we'll see that this doesn't work. There's no output. It's just one color. Even with the color ramp, nothing is showing up. Eevee does not handle attributes the same way Cycles does. So this node does not work. That output doesn't work. The nice thing though is that now with geometry nodes, you can get the same output in Eevee. Where is it? There we go. Using the edge angle node, just putting this into the output of the geometry node system. Let's just call this mask. Now, if we back in the shader editor, we can grab the attribute node, grab the mask attribute, check the color, and we'll see this is the same as in Cycles. There's an edge mask. It is a little annoying to have to use the geometry node setup, but once you have one setup for geometry nodes, you can just copy this onto any other object and it will work with this attribute, right? So yeah, that's a handy little trick that'll hopefully help you. It's a kind of little known trick. I haven't seen almost anyone use it before, but it is there. Okay, next up, glass. Okay, this is a lot of people get this wrong in Eevee. Let's just add a sphere, bring it over here, and we're gonna make this a glass ball. If there are weird shading artifacts, just subdivide it. Okay, so for glass, hopefully you'll know how to shade glass in cycles. For cycles, you just bring the transmission all the way to 1. And then take down the roughness. And in Eevee, we'll see that this kind of looks like glass, right? It's reflecting our HDRI. You'll see if I show it, this is what it looks like. But it's not reflecting our archway at all. Or it's reflecting it, it's not refracting it. Like, we can't see it through the ball. This is where the screen space reflections and the refraction come in. So the screen space reflections are what actually gives the reflections. So like, if I disable it and enable it, you'll see that we can see the reflections of the archway here, but without it we can't. With screen space reflections, basically anything that is reflective and has a roughness under the maximum roughness, I believe, will reflect other objects in the scene. But we can still see that there's no refraction. We can't see through it. Even though we've enabled refraction, nothing is happening. Under the material settings, down here under the settings, to actually get refraction through an object, in the material we need to enable screen space refraction. Now we can see it refracting through it here. If we change the IOR to 2, I believe, to 1, there we go. Now we can actually see through it. Let's reset this to what it's supposed to be now. Another thing that I see some people do, if they don't know how to do this, is to start like setting up blending modes and stuff, like alpha blend and stuff. Don't do that. For glass, you do not need to set a blending mode. You can just set it to opaque in Eevee. Okay, I think that's most of what I was trying to touch on for glass. Is there something I'm forgetting? I can't remember. Oh, one other thing I wanted to touch on is what we did for the archway, generating this base color. This is basically the same stuff that I do for toon shading. Like, if I just grab a diffuse whatever and then the shader to RGB, mix these together and just look at this, we'll just lazily multiply it over. This is exactly what I do for toon shader, basically. For at least getting the base color. I do some more stuff here, but this is the basic idea. Like, look, this looks pretty nice, you know? And the beauty of Eevee is it also still works with this glass shader that's more realistic. Yeah, I think that's basically everything that I wanted to cover. If you have more questions, feel free to drop a comment. Hopefully this tutorial was helpful. I don't know. I feel like I'm missing something, but I'm not sure. Anyhow, bye.